This is the Legacy Radio Network. You are listening to the Everything Financial Radio Show. Welcome back. If you're just joining us, we are chatting today with Mr. Ian Gordon of the Long Wave Group. And Ian, I followed your work for a long time, and I'm a big fan. If a listener wants to learn more about what it is that you do, what would you advise them to do?
Well, they can go to the website, longwavegroup.com, and see our work. Our work is based on the Kondratiev cycle, the Russian economist who formulated this long economic cycle of boom and bust in the mid-1920s. And we think we've expanded quite considerably on Kondratiev's work, and we can essentially accurately predict many things that are going to occur in the economy and within the financial sphere as well.
Ian, we had talked in the last segment about the parallels between the 1930s and today. And, of course, in the 1930s, as you pointed out, the first banking failures occurred in Europe. Seems like we're headed down that road again. When European banks start to fail, what effect will that have on U.S. banks?
Well, I think they're all so closely allied, and once the failures start in Europe, I'm pretty sure that we will see the same kind of cataclysmic failures occurring within the American banking system. And don't forget, the American banking system was effectively saved in 2008. The problem really is that there's a massive amount of derivatives, particularly in the American banks, have on their books, and many of those derivatives are associated with the debt, the sovereign debt. So once that starts to sort of blow up, I think we could have an acute derivative problem in the United States banking system.
Ian, to shift gears a minute, in your June newsletter, you also talk, I believe the headline was, the looming American fiscal cliff crisis. That's a term that we're hearing a lot related to the tax cuts that are set to expire next year, but that's not exactly how you use the term. Can you explain what you mean by the looming American fiscal cliff crisis?
Well, I mean, the real crisis in the United States is the massive budget deficit. And, it's been growing at the rate under Obama's presidency at about $1.3 trillion a year. And effectively, that it means that the United States is essentially bankrupt, and it's being propped up, by the Federal Reserve printing money and giving that money to the United States Treasury, and then taking the loans, the U.S. government debt on the Federal Reserve's books. It's been somewhat helped too by still China still buying U.S. debt. But as I said in the first segment, what happens when the monetary crisis, at least what happened in the 1930s, was that once the countries started to be forced out of the monetary system, speculators sort of moved from country to country in terms of determining who was going to fail next. And we can bet that eventually attention will be focused on the United States because of its massive debt problem, and that in itself will start to force up interest rates in the United States, much as interest rates are going up in countries like Greece, Spain, and Italy. And when that happens, the whole United States budget gets really out of whack, because debt, the interest payments on the debt become a huge component of the U.S. budget.
Ian, I was listening to Mr. Bernanke, who runs the Federal Reserve, talking, and he gave the example, as I recall, that even if interest rates were to go up 1%, it doesn't make that big an impact on a budget. Seems to me, and I'd like your comment, that Mr. Bernanke thinking that given the current state of financial affairs in the United States, using the example that interest rates could go up 1%, it seems to me that he might be living a fairy tale. Aren't we going to see interest rate spikes much higher than that?
Well, I think we will. I mean, interest rates, even in the 30s, in the United States. And as I said, the United States was by far and away the world's largest creditor nation in the 1930s. But when you had a run on the U.S. dollar in the 30s, interest rates in the United States were forced up from about 1% to about 3.5% on the federal funds rate. So that's the short-term rate, and so you can see that we can anticipate that rates are going to go up by much more than just 1%. We're going to see eventually rates in the United States approach the same kind of rates that we see in Spain, 6-7%, as people refuse to fund U.S. debt at these really ridiculously low levels of interest.
So, Ian, given that the bond market will probably mandate that budget cuts occur, and certainly you can't have budget cuts or budget adjustments without attacking entitlements, do you have a thought as to how this plays out here in the United States?
I just think that it's going to be so difficult. I mean, the other day I was listening to Jamie Dimon being sort of grilled, well, somewhat grilled by, I think it was the Senate Banking Committee, and it was amazing. And one of these senators was sort of fawning on Mr. Dimon, saying that his bank was employing something like 28,000 of his constituents, and he thanked his bank very much. So, it's going to be very difficult to see where these budget cuts are going to happen, because there's certainly a reluctance on the part of cutting down on the military expenditures, which is a huge component of the budget. Anyway, and I just don't see where they can effectively, we're going to have political gridlock, and I just don't see where people are really going to come, where politicians are going to sort of come to grips with the problems of the budget deficit in the United States. And I think, the issue is going to be forced on them when you get a massive collapse. And don't forget, in the 30s, the U.S. was such a large creditor nation, they could spend, and they did spend a lot of money in an effort to curtail the depression. But this time around, they just don't have the money to do that. So that I think that we're going to see a depression somewhat much bigger than we saw in the 30s in most countries as well, but particularly in the United States.
Ian, in the 1930s, we saw deflation, and as you pointed out in the last segment, in 1933, President Roosevelt confiscated the gold to the American citizens. The country went off the gold standard, and a deflationary period followed. However, since the last link between the U.S. dollar and gold was eliminated, I think back in 1971 by President Nixon, there have been very few years, if any, where there has been deflation. So when it comes to inflation versus deflation, give us your perspective on how the depression that you're predicting plays out in terms of inflation and deflation.
Well, I just don't think you can have an inflationary depression. I mean, by nature, depressions are deflationary. And the reason that you have a depression at all is it happens because of the massive amounts of debt that are being wrung out of the system. And debt, that debt sort of collapse is, by its very nature, deflationary. So what you see in the United States, I mean, total overall debt in the United States, that's the government, corporate, and consumer debt, is about $54 trillion, and much of that is going to be washed out of the system. You're already seeing that debt being washed out of the housing, out of housing, but it's going to sort of go into all other areas of the consumer debt and areas of corporate debt, and we're going to see, banking failures and so on, and all of that by its nature is deflationary. So I just don't see that you can have an inflationary depression. It's an impossibility. How can prices be rising And how can you print sufficient money to overcome the $54 trillion of debt, much of which is going to be wiped out of the system?
So, Ian, in the time we have left, is it your thought then that at some point Mr. Bernanke throws up his hands and says to Congress, I've done all I can do?
I don't know if he's going to do that, but, I think what's going to happen is that things are going to get so ugly, not only in the United States, but so ugly in the U.S. and elsewhere. I mean, the economies are going to basically collapse. And with that, we're going to have all sorts of problems, including, I think, social unrest.
Ian, we have just a couple of minutes left in this segment. Give me your take. I know you're an economist and not a political analyst, but give me your take on how the upcoming election, the presidential election, plays out in the United States. Do you have a thought?
Well, I really don't think it matters who wins, because the problems really faced by both of them are so enormous. It's almost impossible now to actually affect a solution to the problems. And I think it doesn't really matter. In my opinion, either Romney or Bernanke are doomed to fail because the debt is going to overwhelm them.
We have been chatting with Mr. Ian Gordon. The website is the Long Wave Group. Ian, thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you for having me.
Everything Financial Radio will return after these words. Stay with us.